Welcome aboard. If you're watching this video, then let me be the first to say congratulations. You've recently been hired by the Krusty
Well, hello there, and welcome back to another semester recap video. In today's installment, I'll be walking you through my 2026 spring semester. And if you're new here, just to keep you up to speed, I'm currently attaining my BFA in illustration, and recently I've actually added on a minor in drawing. So let's review what classes I took this semester. Before I get into that, though, I want to give a slight disclaimer. As of the semester recap that you're watching, I added officially on a drawing minor. So because I want to be able to graduate on time, I am kind of overloading a couple of my semesters. Well, really the rest of my junior year and all of senior year. So traditionally most semesters, if you're full-time, is about 12 credits. I'm taking anywhere from 15 to 16 credits for the rest of my duration in this program, just to let you know. So, back to the regularly scheduled programming. The illustration class I took this semester was titled Illustration: A Personal Voice, which this class focused primarily on pre-capstone development and opportunities for exploration, giving us the opportunity to figure out what we want our capstone to be before we have to full send into it in senior year. So because of that drawing minor, I have 2 drawing classes this semester. I think I technically took what I believe I understand to be drawing 2, but this institution calls it drawing idea, image, and process. The other class I took, which I think was drawing 3, is called Figure Drawing, Light, Space, and Design. Additionally, I took 2 other non-studio based courses, one of which was called Theory and Criticism of Art and Design, and the other one was Human Ecology II. See, I thought that class was going to be like, oh, you're learning about how the human condition is impacted by their external environment. No. I was learning about like sickle cell anemia and like HIV, which is important, but not what I was expecting, and I am not a science person, so there's that. So in addition to all of these classes, I continued to be a work study in our on-campus gallery. So in between each class recap, I'm going to show some clips of each show we put up in chronological order. This semester, I took a class called Illustration: A Personal Voice. This course is centered around developing our artistic identity, visual language, and personal themes as illustrators, while also beginning early development work for our future capstone projects. A huge focus of the class was understanding what kinds of imagery, narratives, aesthetics, and ideas continuously appear within our work, and learning how to intentionally build upon those instincts rather than ignoring them. Throughout the semester, we completed a series of assignments that approached personal voice from various angles. Some focused on revisiting past work, some challenged us to step outside of our comfort zones, and others acted as early thesis development opportunities for our future capstone work. The very first assignment was titled Revision, and it focused heavily on artistic self-reflection. For this project, we had to revisit an older artwork, specifically a piece that helped define us creatively or pointed us towards the kind of artist that we wanted to become. Instead of simply recreating the original image, the goal was to reinterpret it from the perspective of who we are now. For me, I chose an artwork I created during Inktober back in 2022. The original piece depicted a deity-like figure representing my interpretation of the divine feminine. Looking back on it, I realized that piece was one of the earliest moments where my spirituality and artistic practice truly became intertwined. So, for the reimagined version, I created a fully realized portrait titled Catharsissa, a sacred guardian figure inspired by saint imagery, Art Nouveau aesthetics, and themes of emotional alchemy. Catharsissa became a figure centered around transformation, specifically the idea of turning difficult experiences into growth and self-understanding. A lot of my work naturally pulls from spirituality, symbolism, and emotional storytelling, so this assignment helped reaffirm that those themes are a really important part of my artistic process. I think this assignment really reaffirmed for me that my work functions best when it exists at the intersection of mythology, spirituality, storytelling, and emotional truth. The second assignment was called The Heal, which essentially acted as the opposite of the first project and encouraged us to confront the areas of image making we struggle with the most. Instead of focusing on what defines us creatively, we had to confront what breaks us artistically, the areas of art making that feel the most difficult, frustrating, or outside of our comfort zone. And for me, that's environments. I feel like that's a consistent theme amongst most illustrators as well, or at least a good population of illustrators. Just environments are just... I've never disliked them, but they're incredibly time consuming and I tend to put a lot of pressure on myself whenever I create them. So instead of giving myself an ulcer, I just avoid them. For this assignment, however, I decided to confront that and make an isometric illustration of a modern witch's apartment or townhouse. If I'm gonna do something that I'm not a fan of, I'm gonna try and make it something that I like, or at least have aesthetics that I enjoy. So, this piece explored the cozy, magical domestic environment filled with books, candles, occult objects, plants, and tiny narrative details hidden throughout the space. Originally, I did want to push the rendering even further with more dramatic lighting and shading, but during our group critique, we collectively realized I was being overly hard on myself. So, sometimes an artwork doesn't need to be pushed into hyper-perfection to still communicate effectively. And I think that this assignment reminded me that not every piece needs to be pushed into perfection in order to communicate effectively what you're desiring to say. So, by the second half of the semester, the course transitioned more heavily into thesis and capstone development. And at that point, the assignments became less about isolated illustrations and more about exploring how a larger body of work can function conceptually, visually, and narratively over time. Now, as my capstone is still in development, as of right now, the possible title is called Stations of the Broom, based off of an ancestor of mine. It's going to be a body of work centering around the story of Anne Izzard, who is an accused witch from Great Paxton, England, whose life became distorted through fear, folklore, accusation, and generational retelling. Now, what interests me most about the story, besides her being my direct ancestor, is the way that folklore, fear, rumor, and historical retelling can completely reshape how a person is remembered over time. Throughout the semester, I explored several visual directions for this project. So the first concept piece I did was titled Of Dreading and Pleading. The work depicts the emotional reality of Anne Izard moments before attempting to prove her innocence by being weighed against the church Bible. The imagery was inspired by an 1808 sermon from Reverend Isaac Nicholson describing her fear, emotional exhaustion, and desperation while her community actively was accusing her of witchcraft. Visually, I wanted the piece to feel more intimate, haunting, and deeply human. Not the image of a monster, but the image of a terrified woman trapped inside a world of gossip, persecution, and rumors. The second concept piece took a dramatically different direction. Titled The Curse of the Ignorant, this artwork leaned into the aesthetics of vintage science fiction posters, graphic novels, exploitation horror, and theatrical pulp imagery. The idea behind this piece was that it would almost function like an introductory poster or title card for the larger capstone experience. It would be the first thing that viewers encounter before entering the narrative world of the Stations of the Broom. So to speak, it's the first station. I wanted the piece to feel dramatic, overwhelming, and almost cinematic in the way that older movie posters used exaggerated composition and visual spectacle to immediately pull viewers into a story. At the same time, I wanted this piece to explore the hysteria that surrounded accusations of witchcraft as well. The title, The Curse of the Ignorant, intentionally shifts the focus away from Anne herself and instead points towards fear, mob mentality, superstitions, and the danger of collective paranoia. Rather than presenting the accused woman as the source of horror, the real horror becomes the behavior of the community surrounding her. Visually, I experimented with bold lighting, graphic shapes, exaggerated typography, and imagery inspired by retro film posters and modern graphic novels. I also wanted the piece to sit in the strange middle ground between sincerity and spectacle, where it feels visually exciting and stylized, while still commenting on the real historical fear and violence that inspired it. I think this assignment helped me better understand how much I enjoy combining historical storytelling with genre aesthetics like horror, camp, fantasy, and pulp illustration. It also made me realize that I'm interested in creating narrative artwork that feels immersive, almost like concept art or promotional material for a larger world that the audience is stepping into. And then came Nanny. This became one of the more experimental, conceptual directions I explored during the semester. Over time, local folklore surrounding Nanny Izard continued to grow after her death, transforming her into a kind of supernatural boogeyman figure with regional storytelling and local legend. Historically, Anne Izzard was a real woman living in Great Paxton in the early 1800s who became the target of witchcraft accusations during a period of intense fear, superstition, and social paranoia. In 1808, members of her community accused her of causing illness and suffering through witchcraft. The accusations escalated to the point where she was physically attacked by townspeople and pressured into attempting to prove her innocence through ritual-like acts tied to local superstition. What interests me most about this history is how quickly rumor and fear can shape a real person into something mythological. Over time, Anne Izzard stopped existing in public memory as simply a woman, and instead became Nanny Izzard, a folkloric figure shaped by exaggeration, retelling, fear, and community storytelling. So for this piece, I decided to explore that idea through the lens of an exaggerated 1980s style slasher film poster. The concept behind Nanny was essentially, what if generations of folklore transformed the historical figure into the villain of a fictional cult horror movie? Visually, the piece pulls heavily from vintage VHS horror covers, slasher posters, grindhouse aesthetics, and folk horror imagery. I wanted it to feel dramatic, chaotic, campy, and slightly ridiculous in the same way many older horror advertisements were, while still quietly commenting on how society sensationalizes fear and creates monsters out of real people. At the same time, there is also an intentional tension within the piece. The artwork participates in the theatricality and exaggeration of the legend, while simultaneously critiquing it. The audience is drawn in by the spectacle that is the fictional horror poster, but underneath that is the reality that Anne Izzard was a real woman whose story became distorted over generations. I think that balance between history, horror, folklore, camp aesthetics, and narrative illustration became a really important realization for me during this project. It helps me recognize how much I enjoy creating artwork that feels immersive and cinematic, while still being rooted in historical storytelling and emotional themes. Overall, this class helped me better understand the kinds of themes and visual storytelling approaches I want to continue exploring moving forward. A lot of my work tends to circle around mythology, spirituality, folklore, symbolism, emotional storytelling, and reinterpretations of historical narratives. And I think this semester really helped me become more confident in allowing those interests to exist more naturally within my work rather than trying to separate them from one another. This semester also included 3 major gallery exhibitions through my work study position, where I helped assist with the installation and preparation of the shows displayed within the campus gallery. The first exhibition, which you're seeing clips of now, was called Tracing Light, Cameraless Photography, a show by artist and former Parsons School of Design professor Anne Arden McDonald. For this installation, I helped with a large portion of the setup and install process, including measuring proper hanging heights, unboxing and organizing the artwork, labeling the work on the walls, and assisting with the installation of several large hanging scroll works. These scrolls were incredibly delicate and required around 4 people to safely handle and hang due to both their scale and fragility. The exhibition itself focused on cameraless photography, which is images created without the use of a traditional or photographic negative. Instead, Anne Arden McDonald uses photographic paper, chemistry, light, and experimental processes to create abstract works that blur the line between photography, painting, and scientific experimentation. A lot of the work explored ideas surrounding circles, atoms, planets, cycles, and wholeness, connecting microscopic and cosmic imagery through abstract photographic processes. What I found especially interesting was how experimental and hands-on the work was. Some pieces incorporated materials like rust, glue, bleach, bubbles, ceramic glazes, and even mold growth on silver gelatin paper to create these really atmospheric and unpredictable results. This semester, I also took a course called Drawing Idea, Image, and Process, which focused heavily on the use of drawing as both a conceptual and technical tool for storytelling, experimentation, and personal exploration. Rather than approaching drawing as purely observational or academic, the class encouraged us to think more deeply about how images communicate meaning. A lot of the projects naturally evolved into emotional or symbolic narratives rather than straightforward technical exercises, which honestly felt very aligned with the direction my artistic practice has already been moving towards. One of the first major projects I created was titled The Pup of Prosopopoeia, which explored a childhood imagination to the personification of a stuffed animal I've personally owned since birth. The title itself references the literary term prosopopoeia, which is the act of giving human qualities consciousness or voice to something non-human. And that idea felt incredibly fitting for the piece because as children, we often treat objects like stuffed animals as if they're genuinely alive, aligning them with personalities, emotions, memories, and relationships. I really wanted the drawing to capture that strange but beautiful emotional reality that exists during childhood, where imagination feels completely tangible and emotionally truthful. Using charcoal and Conte on large watercolor paper, I tried to create this celestial, dreamlike environment where the stuffed animal almost dissolves into these cosmic cloud forms and abstract atmospheric shapes. The celestial imagery became a way of emphasizing wonder, fantasy, emotional memory, and the almost sacred quality childhood imagination can carry before adulthood begins reshaping the way we experience the world. A lot of the visual transitions throughout the drawing were intentionally meant to blur the line between something physical and something imagined. I wanted the piece to exist in that in-between space where memory, fantasy, comfort, and symbolism all begin to blend together. As someone diagnosed with complex PTSD, a large amount of the healing work I've done over the years has involved reconnecting with inner child joy, imagination, softness, and emotional vulnerability. So although the piece isn't literally autobiographical in a direct narrative sense, it absolutely becomes an extension of that healing process through the symbolism, atmosphere, and intention behind the piece itself. One thing I struggled with during the project was knowing when to stop working on it, which I think is a lot of artists' crutch, to be able to be like, when am I done? I tend to overwork details or search for this impossible level of completion, especially with rendering and texture work. Originally, I wanted to push the plush texture of the stuffed animal much further, but eventually I realized that suggesting texture through cross-hatching and atmosphere actually worked a little bit better than hyper-realistically forcing every single detail. And honestly, I think learning when to step back from a piece instead of endlessly overworking it became one of the most valuable lessons I took away from this class overall. Another major piece from the semester explored queer identity, performance, exaggeration, and reclamation through a much more theatrical and stylized lens. Growing up openly queer within religious educational environments often meant aspects of my identity were treated as spectacle, comedy, or something othered. And rather than completely rejecting those experiences, I became interested in reclaiming them through humor, self-awareness, camp aesthetics, and intentional exaggeration. Visually, this piece became one of the loudest and most performative works I created all semester. Unlike the charcoal-based approach of the first drawing, this piece incorporated watercolor, alcohol marker, acrylic paint, Prismacolor colored pencil, and decorative craft materials to create this hyper-saturated, polished, and almost maximalist visual surface. I wanted the materials themselves to reflect the emotional energy of the piece, which is expressive, theatrical, dramatic, playful, and unapologetically visible. The project also helped me realize how much I enjoy combining fine arts processes with contemporary illustrative aesthetics and mixed media experimentation. So, as the semester progressed, the projects became increasingly more spiritual and archetypal for me. One later assignment, which I unfortunately did not get any footage of, but you will see it at the end of this section, it explored the archetype of the maiden, mother, and crone, commonly understood as the triple moon goddess. It appears in several different pantheons and cultural folklores. It examines cycles of femininity, aging, wisdom, transformation, intuition, and spiritual evolution. Although the assignment itself we only had about a week for, the concept immediately felt much larger than the time frame allowed. Even while working on the project, I knew it was something I wanted to continue developing beyond the class itself. I really became interested in how archetypes like the maiden, mother, and crone continue to appear across various mythologies, folklores, spiritualities, and contemporary identities, especially as symbolic representations of transformation and lived experience. And then finally, what you're seeing now as the semester concluded with a thematic final piece titled Sola. This piece personified the sun through symbolic portraiture, celestial imagery, and graphic rendering techniques. What I found especially interesting while creating Sola was realizing that not every piece needs an overwhelmingly complex conceptual framework in order to feel emotionally effective or visually successful. Sometimes an artwork can simply exist because it evokes a feeling, an atmosphere, or a symbolic presence that resonates intuitively. I think I have a tendency to over-intellectualize meaning in some of my work, so creating a piece that allowed itself to be more instinctual and visually driven was honestly refreshing. At the same time, Sola still naturally incorporated many of the recurring themes that have happened throughout the semester in this class: celestial symbolism, spirituality, portraiture, theatrical composition, and emotional atmosphere. By the end of the project, I realized the piece was really functioning as a synthesis of many of the visual and conceptual ideas I had been exploring all semester long, specifically in this class. And similarly to the maiden, mother, crone piece, Sola eventually became the foundation for a much larger body of work I plan to continue developing moving forward. The current idea is to expand it into a larger collection exploring different forms of light and atmosphere, like sunlight, moonlight, golden hour, eclipse imagery, and other celestial states interpreted through symbolic portraiture. By the end of the semester, I realized many of the projects had started connecting with one another both visually and conceptually. Themes of spirituality, emotional transformation, celestial imagery, folklore, theatricality, symbolism, identity, and storytelling continually resurfaced across these different assignments regardless of the materials or the subject matter. So when it comes to these last two projects and their further development, stay tuned to my Instagram to see how these larger collections pan out to be. So, going back through the footage, I realized I unfortunately didn't capture any video from the second exhibition I helped install this semester. However, in the on-campus gallery, it was one of the locations for the annual Senior Showcase, where graduating BFA candidates exhibited the capstone projects they had spent the past year, and in many cases even longer, developing and refining. While I wasn't able to document the installation itself, it was incredibly exciting to see the work finally occupy the gallery space. There's something really special about watching ideas that previously existed as sketches, conversations, and works in progress transform into fully realized exhibitions. As someone who will be entering my own capstone year soon, it was also a very valuable source of insight and inspiration. Seeing how different artists approached storytelling, presentation, installation, and thematic development gave me a much clearer understanding of what lies ahead as I begin to develop my own project. And now, on to the final studio course of the semester: figure drawing, light, space, and design. Like most figure drawing courses, photography and especially videography during class sessions is heavily discouraged out of respect for the live models and the learning environment. Because of that, I wasn't able to capture any footage during class itself. And I wasn't gonna risk it. Because 1, no, and 2, No. So, much like previous figure drawing recaps I've done, we'll be looking through the work in a slideshow form while I talk a bit about the experience overall. This semester, I officially added a drawing minor alongside my illustration degree, largely because I genuinely enjoy this avenue of art. There's something endlessly fascinating about the human figure and the countless ways artists choose to interpret it. Every artist sees the body differently, just like every person sees the body differently. Some focus on anatomy, some focus on gesture, some focus on abstraction, emotion, light, movement, design, and so on. It's one of the oldest subjects in art, yet it never seems to stop offering new ways to explore it. As an illustration major, figure drawing also directly benefits the work I create outside the classroom. Whether I'm designing characters, creating narrative scenes, or building imaginary worlds, having a stronger understanding of the human form only strengthens my illustration practice. Throughout the semester, I found myself becoming increasingly interested in mark making and surface quality. During the longer poses, I focused heavily on developing stronger rendering, more polished value relationships, and a greater sense of form and structure. And with the shorter gesture drawings, however, my priorities shifted. Rather than chasing perfect accuracy, I became much more interested in capturing the energy, movement, and rhythm of a pose. Sometimes a quick drawing can communicate more life and personality than a highly rendered one if the gesture feels believable and alive. I also discovered a real appreciation for Conte as a medium. It feels like this wonderful middle ground between charcoal, colored pencil, and crayon, capable of producing both delicate passages and bold, expressive marks. It quickly became one of my favorite mediums to work with throughout the semester. Looking back through the work now, I can see a noticeable improvement in both confidence and observation. More than anything, this class reinforced the importance of slowing down, trusting what I was actually seeing, and allowing the drawing process to become a conversation between observation and interpretation. At the end of the day, every character, every illustration, and every story I create ultimately begins with understanding the human figure, and this class helped me to explore that even more deeply. Towards the end of the semester, I had the opportunity to gallery sit at one of the locations hosting the MFA thesis exhibition. The exhibition showcased the work of graduating MFA candidates across multiple locations. Each artist displayed different works at each venue, creating a much larger exhibition experience spread across several spaces. Spending time in the gallery gave me the chance to sit with the work in a way that's very different from quickly walking through an exhibition. You begin noticing details you may have missed at first glance. You watch how visitors interact with the artwork, you hear conversations and questions and interpretations, and you get a better sense of how artists communicate ideas through an entire body of work rather than through a single piece. Coming right after seeing the senior showcase, a couple weeks prior, it was interesting to experience another level of artistic development represented by the MFA candidates. And because I was a gallery attendant on the day of the MFA candidates defending their thesis, it was a really cool glimpse into what it looks like to defend an MFA thesis. As someone who's beginning to think more seriously about capstone work and larger bodies of work in general, it was genuinely inspiring to see the range of approaches, materials, concepts, and presentation styles on display. More than anything, it was a reminder that artistic growth never really stops. Every exhibition becomes the starting point for whatever comes next. And with that pretty much wraps up this semester. Looking back, it was definitely a busy one. Between studio classes, gallery installations, the work study position, exhibitions, and everything happening outside of school, there was never really a shortage of things to work on. One thing I found interesting while putting this recap together was realizing how many of these projects aren't actually finished. A lot of the work from this semester is continuing beyond the classroom. Some pieces are turning into larger series, others are becoming future paintings, and a few are finding their way into projects I wasn't even thinking about when the semester began. Which honestly is probably one of my favorite things about being an artist. Sometimes an assignment ends when the semester ends, and sometimes it accidentally follows you home. As for what's next, well, I've got a pretty busy summer ahead. There's gallery work, illustration projects, an upcoming residency in New York, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I'll also be preparing for my senior year and eventual capstone project. So while this semester may be over, the work definitely is not. Thank you again for following along through this semester recap and watching me as I took you through it. And remember, I'll see you in the next one.